Hello and welcome to anyone who's watching this video. This video is on how to refurbish an old hand plane and make it fit for use. I don't use the word restore because that implies you're putting it back to its original condition from the factory, and that's not what this is about. It's about refurbishing it just to get it back into working condition. I was in two minds whether to do this video or not because there are so many videos on YouTube on how to refurbish hand planes. But being I'd done a video on tips and hints on buying old planes, I thought I'd put my two penneth in and just show a no fuss approach I have to cleaning them up, getting them ready and using them. So just for the purpose of transparency, this one has already been stripped and cleaned, because these screws sometimes are rusted in, sometimes they're tight, and getting them out isn't always easy. And to make a video on that, I think it'd just be boring and over long, to be honest, and also it's the mess. So this one has been stripped and reassembled for the purpose of this video. But typically it would start out like this, purchased from photographs, in that sort of condition. I've probably bought around the 50 mark in old planes. Out of those I probably still have around 30. Of the others, ones that were workable, I've given to friends and work colleagues, and some can't be refurbished. They're due to manufacturing faults or rust or breakages. They're just beyond repair or use. So those I tend to just scrap them or scavenge parts off them. So we'll start with this one, and when I get a plane it'll come in rough. The first thing I do is just evaluate it as to whether it's worth spending the time on. So what I tend to do is just flatten the base, the sides, just as is, still in its working clothes, just to see if the casting's flat enough and usable. And also sometimes you can come across cracks that you can't see when it's all covered in dirt. So my method for doing that is, I'll just move that out the way. I use a piece of Georgian wired glass. This is just an old second-hand piece that I picked up from work. I find it ideal for doing this sort of job. I tend to use now, I used to faff around a bit with when I first started doing them, and starting with 2 finer grit sandpaper. So I'd be like starting with 180 grit sandpaper, and I'd be there for, well, possibly days trying to get them flat. And now I just go straight for 60 grit. A roll like this, which is 5 metres, in the UK probably costs about 12 quid from Screwfix, and I'll just start with that. I won't even cut it to length. I'll just roll it out on the piece of glass. I'll take the blade. I'll take the blade out. Out of the way, and I know this is this could be controversial, but I'll explain why I do it later. Some people like to flatten them with the frog in, but I personally like to slacken the frog off, just so it's just held in place, it's not rattling, not tight, and I'll explain why I do that later. And then I just set about. I tend to just hold the edge of the sandpaper and just rub back and to with it until I've got roughly a clean piece of metal. I do the sides, and then I can evaluate as to whether it's going to be worth spending any more time on it. So once I've got to that stage and I'm happy that it's a viable plane, then I'll put a bit more work in. If you want to go finer with the sandpapers and get the bed smoother or shinier, then that's entirely up to how much time you want to spend on it. But the finer you go with the sandpapers, the more blemishes you'll show. As you get it more and more polished, it'll show more and more flaws, chips and nicks and stuff like that. The next thing I do is completely strip it down, take absolutely everything off it. So now I know the casting's usable, I just completely gut it. Because otherwise it's not worth putting the effort in. If the base isn't, or the sole isn't right, it's not worth putting the effort in cleaning everything else up. You might as well just use the parts for something else. So I did have an issue with this one, which I'll show now. And this is the sort of things you can come across when you're doing them, is that this handle wouldn't come off. It was fast on there. Even though the screw was undone, it would not leave the casing, the casting. And if you're in that situation, there is no kind way of dealing with it. You can't, there's nothing you can do to make that kind. The risk is you'll break the handle, which isn't the end of the world, because you can epoxy them back together and make quite a good job of it. But this did not want to come off here. It's still snug now. And yeah, it's still snug now. So eventually I just had to force it off. And the result of that was that it didn't break the handle, but it broke the bar off in the casting. Now, as you can see, the reason it wouldn't come off, part of the reason was, excuse me, part of the reason was that this had rusted into the handle, so it was holding on to the wood, and so it wouldn't slide off the bar. So something had to give. I did in the end having to get a screwdriver under the handle and bar it up to try and get a bit of movement on it and wiggling it around, which you can damage the bottom of the handle, but there is no other solution to getting it off if it's stuck like that. But as you can see, there's rust in there. I've cleaned this out here with, I've reamed around it a bit with a drill bit, and I've cleaned it out with a round file. And I've actually slightly drilled that hole out as well, because what was actually wrong with it was, when that's on that lug, it's a snug fit, and it was actually sort of catching on this tight on this back part here, so it was kind of almost like locking into position once you pushed it on, and as you've just seen, it's still a bit stubborn. But if you're in that situation, you've got no other option but to force it. What happened then was, of course, it had left a piece of metal. It had left the end of that stud in that casting, and that doesn't happen very often. In this case, I was able to catch some light on it. I was able to put a shallow saw cut in the top, not far in the casting, just a very shallow saw cut across there. And then I could get a small screwdriver, because the actual stud wasn't stuck in the thread, it wasn't rusted into the thread. The thread in there is actually quite shiny, but it was just that the bar was rusted into the handle, so it wouldn't come off. and in the end something had to give, and it was the bar. So I've got spare ones of these. This one might still be long enough. Sometimes they're too long, and it might still have enough thread on it. It might still have enough length on it to use, but I shall bin that one and use the replacement I found. So I strip absolutely everything off. So we've just got a pile of parts basically. Don't leave anything together. So strip it all. Everything that comes off, take off. So you end up with a completely broken down plane. Sometimes these are stuck on the end of the, when you unscrew them, they'll be stuck on the end of the bars. They bottom out on the bar and got tight, and when you take them out they come out like a bolt, but just you can put that in a vise or just hold it in a pair of pliers and they'll just wind up. They're never really stuck. The only things I leave intact is that threaded piece in there. There's no point in removing that. It would be difficult anyway. I don't remove the wide piece because again there's not much point in removing that, and I never interfere with the lateral adjuster because I've had experiences of, I've had some of these that have been damaged or broken and I've tried to take them off, and trying to rivet them back on it's not easy, and I've broke the casting on one or two, so I've learnt my lesson. Leave them be if they're all right. Only do that if you've got no option, and then only when you're desperate. So once I've got it all stripped, I'll then have a look at, because you can get to the edges now. A lot of these older planes, the edges are ground on them. So I tend to use just a small drum wheel like that in a drill, just slowly, just to clean them up, because it's quicker. It's quicker than doing it by hand, and I just do across the front, and any surfaces that are curved I just briefly run over with that. Those are readily available from Screwfix and Toolstation in kits. They only cost about 10 quid. So once I've got to that stage and everything's off, I wash it all in white spirit. So I just take it all, not the handles, I leave the handles, but I wash everything else off in white spirit, and that gets all debris from the cleaning the base off, and all the grit that you've generated from cleaning the bed. One word of caution with that is that obviously you're using a sandpaper. You can see there's black on there because I've used it, and it's obviously metal dust. Now, a word of warning with that, because if you get it on anything, it's lethal stuff to get off. It'll leave iron stains. As you know, iron stains are one of the worst things to remove from anything, and I've been in a position where I normally take mine outside and do them on a table in the garden, but I put a big old sheet down on the table, put the piece of glass on there and just sand it off, and then when I've finished I brush the metal filings off the glass onto the sheet, and then I'll take them somewhere in the garden where there's just soil and just shake it out and keep it for that purpose. Don't put it in your washing machine. Just leave it and use it for that job. If you're only doing one, just scrap it and put it in the bin. But if you get it on your clothes, it can stain them really badly. And if you get it on like patio or concrete or stone or anything like that, it'll just go rusty, and getting iron stains out of concrete is, or brick sets or anything like that. It's an absolute nightmare. So just be careful where you do it. It also rather unkind to your hands, as you can see from this cracking and splitting. That metal dust that comes off gets into your skin and dries it up somehow, and that'll be weeks before that's cleaned itself off. So it might be an idea to wear gloves. So once I've got all the parts clean and all the main dirt out of the way, I'll set about the brass, anything that's brass. So these little nuts off the handles, I just drop them in a small glass on that wheel, and then I just use ordinary vinegar, just ordinary standard vinegar, and just pour that over it. Make sure that you haven't trapped any bubbles in there, because if there are any bubbles, if that handle happens to be the other way up and there's a bubble in it, you'll end up with a patch. And I'll leave it in there for about an hour. I wouldn't leave it any longer than that, because it can start to tarnish. Rather than clean it, it starts to tarnish the brass. So after about an hour in there, I'll take them out with some soap and water. They'll be like a kind of pinky colour and they'll be dull. But then I'll take some soap and water and set about with what I call Scotch Brite, but I think it's got all sorts of names, but this is a sort of medium grade one, like a kind of abrasive cloth. And I'll just soap and water, just clean them all up, and they'll come up nice and shiny easily. And I wouldn't use any emery or anything really abrasive on it. A bit of fine wire wool would probably be okay. So that sorts the handles out. The rest of it, I don't go too fussy about degreasing nuts and things like taking the rust off nuts and things like that. I do tend to just get a bit of emery paper. If it's just a basic fitting like that, I just tend to get a bit of emery paper and just knock the surface rust off, just so that it's clean and it's got a bit of shine to it. I don't spend too much time on it. I believe you can get stuff to de-rust things, but I've never used it. It's the same with those. Just get a bit of emery cloth and paint and clean them up. So the handles is the next thing. So what I typically find is the handles tend to be like this. They've got like a varnish on them and it's started to crack and peel off. The easiest way I've found of dealing with this is, excuse my crude tool, but this old knife I've found it is just ideal for scraping off the varnish, and it quickly removes the old finish, and just work over that with the grain. And I found this is the quickest way of doing it, rather than trying to sand it off, because if you sand it off it tends to lose the shape of the handle. Some places will be sanded more than another and all that sort of thing. So I tend to just scrape all that old finish off as best I can with the grain by working with the grain as much as is possible. And it's surprising how quickly it comes off. It is messy, so you might not want to be doing it in the house like I am at the moment. And then I just use a bit of 180 emery paper. I mean, any sandpaper would do, fine sandpaper. I just clean that surface up just to smooth it off, and it's quick and easy. It doesn't lose the shape of the handle, and you'll end up with something like that. It's a bit antique looking, but that's fine. What I do with them then is because I tend to finish them with gunstock oil, which I find a really good finish for any tool handle. I like that particular one, it builds really well. But if you put that on there, it will look a bit sort of antique-y and almost like maybe it's been kind of burned. So what I tend to do is give them a coat of an oil-based stain. This one's mahogany, but it's the only one that you can see the label on, but I tend to like walnut as a colour. But it needs to be an oil-based stain. Well, not really a stain, they're called dyes. It needs to be an oil-based dye, because if you use a water-based one, it'll raise the grain horribly, and the problem with it then is you could rub it down again, but the problem is then you rub the stain off and it starts to look patchy and uneven, and you can't get it back to even. So the quickest method is get an oil-based wood dye, give your handle a full coat, and let it dry naturally, at least overnight, and then give it a coat of gunstock oil. I usually give a good coat, just let it soak in for 5 or 10 minutes, rub it off, let that dry, and then just wipe as many coats on till you get the finish that you want. I like a satin finish personally. So when you come to the sort of all the other bits and bobs that go with it, like this capping iron, for instance, is quite tarnished. The original finish has gone on it. Some of them will be nickel, excuse me. Some of them will be nickel plated. Some of them will be chromed, and there's not much you can do with that really. I tend to just emery cloth them off, just to clean them up, get them shiny, or if there's flaking chrome, get that off. They would typically probably turn out like that, just clean and smooth and worn, but at the end of the day it's shown its age. It deserves to look like that. It's still around after anywhere between probably 50 and 100 years, maybe even somewhere around there. So I'm happy with them in that sort of condition, just smooth and cleaned. I have tried to I've never tried to replate one or rechrome one, but I'm sure it's possible. But I have tried to clean them down to bare metal and then put a clear lacquer on them, but there's not much for a working plane, there's not much to be gained by that, to be honest. So the blades themselves, the only really area that matters, to be honest, is this area here. The rest of it doesn't really matter. Any pits that are in this area that manage to make the way to the edge will be a nick in the blade. So if you've got very often the pittings in lines where the capping iron's been sitting, so you can sometimes grind the line of pits out and get to a clean piece of metal. Myself, I do have a linisher at work and like a bench mounted belt sander, and I just tend to just dust the back of them a little bit to clean them off and take some of the pitting out. But if it's too bad, you obviously can't take too much off the thickness of the blade. So try and get to a piece of blade that isn't pitted that you're using. Sometimes then as you wear down, there's a pit there, you'll get into that. That might have gone by the time you get there, because with constantly sharpening it might have worked its way out, but if it hasn't, just grind past it and get back into some fresh metal. And I just tend to emery cloth these up to clean the rust off them and just take the edges off. The same with the capping iron. Again, it doesn't really matter. This one, you can see, has got a great big burr where the thread is there. I personally would file it. It doesn't really matter, it's not fouling anything, but I would personally file that off. Just run the file across the top and just flatten it and tidy it. And then the front of it there, if it's sitting on the blade flat and there's no gaps, then it's good to go really along that edge. If it's sitting up or it's hollow or it's got a gap on it, then sometimes the shavings will go underneath and start fouling the mouth, which can be a problem. So I tend to just take a file on them and just flat this back a bit. So if that's a file, well, I've got a file here, I'd use a bigger file than this, a wider file than this, but I'd just file the edge back into there flat, just so it's slightly backed off, so that front edge comes into contact with the blade nice and tight. I'd have a quick look at the frog. Again, I'd just run a file over the surfaces just to make sure that it's not got any lumps or bumps on it, and that there's no rust sticking up or snots or things, just to make sure the face is flat. And then after that, you're probably pretty much ready to go back together. You've cleaned everything up and it's pretty much ready. You've got your handles cleaned up and your brass work. What I like to do then is to grease out all the threads as I'm putting them back together. So I just use a standard car grease, and I'll use a cocktail stick if I'm reassembling. I'll just get some grease on the end of there and put it inside the thread, and I'll grease the screws. The reason that I see that as good practice is, for one thing, it's not rusting out of sight where you can't see it, and also you're prolonging the life of the tool, maybe for another generation who might be in a position to use it. When I put this back together, when I put this screw into it, I tend to leave this a little bit slack, this one, because they tend not to be too accurate. And bear in mind, all this would have been cleaned up and be a bit shinier than this, but these tend to be a bit kind of movable, so I tend to leave them that way. I'll explain why in a minute. So that they've got a bit of flex in them, so that you can move the frog around without that interfering with the it'll still adjust in its length, but it just gives you a bit of so that it's not binding on this screw here. So we get to why I slacken the frog off before I flatten the base. And the reason for that is, you'll see here now that there's paint on these surfaces from when it was made. Let's see if I can catch some light on that. There's paint on these surfaces from when it was made, and there's actually a big blob of paint on there. You can visibly see that that's actually a lump. So ideally those surfaces need to be flat. So I would just get a screwdriver and just scrape the paint off. Just make sure the surfaces have not got any obstruction on them. If you do find one that's maybe got a machining error in it and it's got a lump on, you can try and clean it off, or with the end of a file try and scrape it a bit, but basically make sure those surfaces are clean and there's no paint on them, because that will interfere with how the frog sits. And the same goes for this part as well. That might have picked up paint from from the actual surface of the other one when it was together, but just scratch them off just to make sure that there's nothing on them, that they're clean surfaces. Well, you can see how much paint's on that one. There's actually a rib of paint on that one, and that will interfere with the mating surfaces, so just clean those off. Any paint, any rust, any burrs, just clean them off. I sometimes get a small file like that and just rub across and make sure there's no burrs on them. And that's all you need. You just need a clean surface. It doesn't need to be shiny and spotless. What I would do now is I would grease these surfaces with a very thin layer of grease, and those there, because it'll preserve it for future, and it'll stop it rusting where you can't see it. So going back to why I slacken the frog off before I flatten the base, as I hear people saying that tightening the frog in will distort the base. Now I personally don't see how that can happen if the frog and the base mate together. I don't quite understand how the frog would distort the base. So, being as when I started, I didn't know the condition of the frog sitting in the bed. That's why I knocked the tension off it. So the bed's been flattened as its natural state. And then I put the frog in and see if there's any play in it. Is the frog sitting on the bed nice and firm? And that one is, it's not rocking. So I don't think tightening a frog down that's flat is going to have any distorting effects on a bed, personally, in my experience. If the frog's twisted, maybe it might exert some load onto the bed. Whether the frog would twist or the bed would twist or both would twist, I don't know. Hi, we're back. Sorry about that interruption, but the postman came and my dog doesn't like the postman, so the ensuing chaos caused me to abort the video. So we'll try and pick up where I was. So setting the frog back, I mean, the reassembly of the plane is just reverse of how you took it apart. You've cleaned everything, you've got everything ready. But the frog, I know a lot of people kind of question where it should be and all that sort of thing, but I personally like to pick a blade. You can use your blade if you haven't sharpened it, and gently, but this is just one I use that I'm not using for anything in particular. It's just a spare one, but if you put it on the frog and just slide it down and just see if there's no interference with the bed, then that's the position I like my frog in. I know people adjust the frogs to to change for different timbers and all that sort of thing, but for general use, on this type of run-of-the-mill Stanley plane, you're not going to get a tight mouth on it anyway, so I like to line this surface of the frog up with that bevel there. On a nice old plane like this, they will be the same angle. On some cheaper ones, they're not necessarily. You might have to do a little bit of filing. But then if you look down it, you can't see. You can't see the bed interfering with the frog, and if you can look that way, you'll see that you can see straight down the frog, and it's a nice level plane from the frog through to the mouth. That's how I like them to be. So that's just my tip for lining the frog up. I think that just about covers all the aspects of it. What you typically end up with is something like this. A nice clean usable plane, not immaculate, it's still got some scars and blemishes on it from its age, but the brasswork's cleaned up, and the handles, I like these handles with a satin gunstock finish on, but the more gunstock oil you put on, you can actually get them to a gloss if you want to, but I like a satin finish myself. This one happens to have a nice clean capping iron on it, which is chrome. You know, this one that I've got here is not going to clean up to that standard. It's probably going to be more like this one, but I personally don't mind that. It shows part of its age, it's perfectly usable, and I think that just about covers everything there is to cover, without overcomplicating things. So yeah, thanks for watching.